The town of Dry Creek sat low and sunburned under the wide sky, its boardwalk squeaking with every step and its air heavy with dust that clung to lungs and the soul alike. And into this place of hard stares and harder lives walked Clara Mayfield, a young widow clutching her baby boy to her breast as though the child were the only anchor she had left in a world determined to cast her adrift. Her head bent slightly beneath the weight of whispered words that followed her like the tail of a rattlesnake. Some women standing outside the mercantile with their bonnets stiff against the wind glanced her way and shook their heads, murmuring to one another that she was nothing but a burden, dragging a baby along in a town that barely had enough to feed itself. And the men leaning on the posts outside the saloon smirked and muttered, making no effort to hide their disdain. For in their minds a woman alone with a child was weakness embodied, a reminder that tragedy could make beggars of anyone. Yet Clara kept her pace steady, her lips pressed thin as she adjusted the quilt around Samuel, her son, whose tiny hand had found its way out to curl around the edge of her dress, and she whispered to him softly, almost as though the words were more a shield for her own heart than comfort for his ears, telling him that he was loved, that he was wanted, that no matter what the town said he was her blessing. And yet, as the afternoon heat swelled and the dust rose around her boots, she felt the sting of loneliness sharper than ever, for it had been only half a year since Tom, her husband, had gone into that mine outside town and never returned, crushed beneath a timber that snapped like a toothpick when the earth trembled, and she had buried him with tears enough to water the barren land, carrying Samuel in her belly and hoping against hope that the baby's first cry would heal some of the ache, but instead it had only magnified her isolation, because with Tom gone, the Mayfield name meant nothing, and her kin back east had long since cut ties when she chose to follow her heart westward, leaving her with no family save the tiny bundle in her arms, who cried through the nights and reached with need she struggled to meet. The town had tolerated her at first, out of pity perhaps, offering scraps of bread, a place by the church fire on bitter nights, but pity curdled quickly into disdain when the weeks stretched on and Clara could not find steady work, when her attempts to sew for others or take in laundry were met with muttered excuses and finally outright refusals, for no one wanted to hire a girl whose baby's cries might wake the household. No one wanted to share what little they had with one they deemed a lost cause. So Clara found herself walking the streets more often than not with an empty stomach and Samuel's needs pressed heavy on her soul, trying to appear stronger than she felt, though each step through Dry Creek chipped away at the fragile pride she carried like armor. And so that afternoon by the well, with the sun a white-hot blaze above, she dropped the bucket into the cool dark below and began to draw, her arms straining with the effort, Samuel stirring restlessly against her chest, when the sound of hooves reached her ears, slow and measured, not the hurried gallop of a drunk rider nor the angry stomp of a man chasing debt, but steady, purposeful, and she turned to see him, a cowboy riding in from the west, broad-shouldered in the saddle, his hat pulled low, dust clinging to his shirt and boots, his horse a chestnut with a coat that gleamed even beneath layers of road dust, and though Clara had seen him before at a distance she had never spoken to him, for he was a man of few words and fewer entanglements, his name whispered in town as Jake Colton, the rancher who lived beyond the ridge where the land stretched wide and unclaimed by others, a man who had carved out a living with his own two hands and asked nothing from anyone, keeping mostly to himself. Riding into town only when supplies demanded it, he dismounted with the quiet grace of a man born to the saddle, tying his reins loosely before walking toward the well, his boots crunching softly on the dust, and when his gaze lifted to Clara's face she felt her breath catch, not because his features were striking though they were rugged in the way of men who had known sun and wind more than comfort, but because his eyes, steady and unflinching, held no trace of judgment, no pity, only a calm regard that felt like water poured over fire. He tipped his hat and offered a simple greeting, "Ma'am," his voice low, steady, carrying more respect in that single word than she had been offered in months, and Clara, startled, managed only a small nod, her lips parting to respond but silenced by Samuel's sudden cry that cut through the hot air like a blade, the child's wail rising, making heads turn across the street where men and women alike paused in their business just long enough to sneer or shake their heads, one man outside the saloon with whiskey heavy on his breath chuckling cruelly, saying loud enough for all to hear, "There it is again, that burden of a babe, dragging his ma down like an anchor. Town's better off without her and her squalling brat," and the laughter that followed pierced Clara deeper than any bullet could have, for she wanted to shout that Samuel was no burden, that he was all she had left of Tom, that his cries were life itself, but her throat tightened and the words stuck, so she bent low, rocking her son gently, whispering a lullaby half broken by the crack of unshed tears. "Hush now, little one, you're my blessing, always my blessing." Though she doubted anyone but Samuel heard it, yet someone did hear, for Jake Colton's jaw tightened, a flicker of something hard passing across his face, and he turned his head slowly toward the saloon, his gaze narrowing with a weight that seemed to press the air itself still, and the laughter faltered as men shuffled their boots, pretending suddenly to be interested in their drinks or the dust at their feet. For Jake was not a man to cross lightly, not because of a quick temper he was known for the opposite of, but because his words, when spoken, carried the weight of a man who meant them with his whole being, and so when he stepped closer to Clara and spoke, his voice carried across the street like a low rumble of thunder. "She's no burden," he said, calm but edged with iron, "and that child he ain't no curse, ain't no anchor dragging anyone down. He's a blessing, just like his mother." And the hush that fell was heavy enough to smother every whisper, every cruel smirk, the townfolk shifting uncomfortably, some ashamed, some indignant, none brave enough to answer, and Clara, stunned, felt her knees weaken, for in all the months since Tom's death not once had another soul spoken so boldly on her behalf. Not once had anyone declared aloud what she had clung to in her heart through the sleepless nights, that Samuel was a blessing, and she, though battered and weary, was not nothing, not a burden, but worth defending. Her lips trembled as she looked up at Jake, the words caught in her throat, gratitude and disbelief warring inside her, and he, without waiting for thanks, simply tipped his hat again, reached for the heavy bucket she had struggled with, and lifted it as though it were nothing, his arm steady, his manner quiet, saying only, "Let me carry this for you," and in that moment Clara felt something she had thought long buried, a hope, fragile as a flower pushing through dry earth, hope that maybe, just maybe, she was not as alone as she believed, and as Jake walked beside her toward the shade of the church steps where she could rest, she found herself daring, for the first time in a long while, to imagine that the world might still hold a place for her and her child.